Hi guys.
Hello.
Hey folks.
So, Benji, the the more uh, I live with shorter hair, the more I'm impressed with your always perfectly shaven head. Because I now know how much work this must be, which I never thought of before. But just seeing that if I shave my head and 2 days later I could shave it again, completely crazy.
Yeah, believe it or not, I used to actually have long hair like down past my shoulders, and it was honestly much easier to look after that than it is looking after this.
Well, the good thing is that the price for the hairdresser is more or less the same, right? Because you just don't go to the hairdresser depending if you have no hair or you have long hair, as a man at least.
Just a quick shout out whilst we're waiting for everyone to connect. But if you would like to help review the talks for this year's GraphQL Conf, technically the date for the subject matter experts has already passed. But if you were to submit in like the next couple of hours, I'm sure that you might make it in under the wire. I'll drop a link to that in the chat. There's quite a few people who've added themselves to the agenda who haven't made it here yet, so we'll just give them another minute or two to join, and then I'll get us started if Lee's not here by then.
Hey everyone. I don't know why am I doing this, but
Hi, meta people.
yeah, we have a team
You have an
meetup.
office?
Hi.
No, we have a team meetup in New York. Actually, Rob, we should meet up. I'm like a river away from New Jersey, so and then Matt is trying to.
You are in the meeting now.
Cool.
Recording in progress.
That's funny. Everyone is sitting at the last, the last possible place on this table. Oh, wow.
All right. Well, since three people turned up at once, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the May edition of the GraphQL Specification Working Group. By being here, we have all agreed to the specification membership agreement, the participation guidelines, the contribution guide, and the code of conduct. And we are aware that the meetings are both recorded and published to YouTube, and that we make the use of large language models and AI summary tools on our notes. I'll hand over to Lee for an introduction of the attendees.
Thanks for kicking us off, Benji, and sorry, friends, for being late. I had the classic laptop logs you out of all things at the same time when you open it up. Welcome, crew. Us go through a quick round the room intro of folks, just so we get names to faces. We'll go through the list as it appears in the agenda file. I'm at the top, so hello, folks. My name is Lee.
Hey, Rob from First Dibs.
Hey, folks, it's Benji here.
This is Koi. Oh, this is Jeanette.
Hi, I'm Matt.
Pascal from Chile.
Michael from Cherry Cream.
Martin from Apollo.
I'm Jeff from Apollo.
I'm Guilherme. You can call me Guy from Shopify.
Alex from DoorDash and the Nullability Working Group.
Anybody else on the call that we didn't catch? Sweet. Perfect. Everybody got their name on the attendee list. Thank y'all for doing that. Meta crew, I hope you're all having fun in New York. It looks like a party. And welcome, Guy. All right, we have a long list of super interesting stuff to dig into today. So without further ado, we're going to jump directly into agenda. Benji, you got the top of the list.
Okay, cool. So this is actually one of our ready for review action items, and that is the GraphQL.js version policy. We have a lot of versions of GraphQL.js out there, and some of them are quite old. So we do not guarantee that we'll keep all versions up to date. We actually have now a version policy. I am essentially radiating the intent that that is going to become our version policy, and probably next week, maybe the week after, I'm going to go and deprecate all versions of GraphQL.js prior to version 15. So v14, v13, and so on backwards are all going to be deprecated. If you do not think this is the correct course of action, then please make yourself known on that agenda item that is linked, on that action item that's linked in the agenda. Otherwise, no need for discussion. Move on to the next item.
Yeah, thanks for picking this back up and getting across the finish line. I know it's been sitting for a couple of months. This should be an extremely not contentious support policy. It's actually pretty generous in terms of the region that we support. So thank you, Benji, for getting this across the line. Let's ship it. And Rob, you're up next.
Yeah, so we talked about this in the last meeting or two. coming up with a definition for what a GraphQL request returns. And in the last meeting, we talked about calling it a response payload or response map, something like that. Got some feedback and came up with a new proposal that I'll link in the chat, which is calling it, so defining a response as either a execution result, which is the normal thing. You got execution began, you got some data, maybe some errors. A response stream, which is for subscriptions, and that's a stream of execution results. Or if there was an error before execution began, a request error result, which is no data and the request errors. So this PR defines those and makes the updates where necessary, moves a few things around to, I think, make it a little bit clearer. And the intention is that with incremental delivery, there would be a new type of the incremental stream or something similar to that. But yeah, but this is laying the groundwork for that. So if anyone would love to hear thoughts, if anyone has any or anything else.
I approve of this PR.
It's just blowing up the PR to go through every comment so far. Yeah, I'm curious if other folks have feedback. It's a little unfair for me to give in feedback first because we've been talking offline a little bit about this change. So,
I just want to clarify for everybody. Basically, what this specific PR does is it splits errors that happen on the request outside of execution, so therefore no data can be returned, into the request error. And then there's execution result, which can itself have errors, but also has data available because it was an issue in like the actual GraphQL portion of the thing, which that feels like a much cleaner breakdown than what we had before. I like this a lot.
That was the errors specifically were already defined. We had a request error versus a field error, which was recently changed to an execution error. This is defining the overall response of the errors happening.
I think it becomes clearer that is the state. Like this PR, even just skimming through real quick, it was very clear that is what it was describing. So that is a win to me. I'm thumbs upping that.
Oh, by the way, we just raised a hand, but apparently nobody can see it.
Oh no.
Did anyone see a hand from?
Oh, I see a hand now.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, we'll try to keep a closer eye on hands. Sometimes it's hard to see in Zoom.
Did we think about how this translates to? I overall like this this description, and the fact that we have types like TypeScript types to explain everything makes it really easy to process. Question I have is, did we already think about what it means for GraphQL over HTTP in terms of response types? I would expect that each of these response would have its own media type, or is it not the case?
No, I don't think that they will have different media types. I don't think they need to. It is a good point, though. Like the fact of the missing the data key is based. The difference is they both may have errors, but the error response type doesn't need to have data, in which case it must have errors. But broadly, like the shape of them is still the same. So I think we're okay from the GraphQL over HTTP response. We could give I don't think we need to give it a media type for that. I think that would just it would just add more work to all the intermediary servers without really giving much value.
So everything is GraphQL response plus JSON.
Yes, and you could use the status code to differentiate whether it's an error result or not, because those would be 400s or 500s.
I'm thinking more specifically about subscriptions and defer. Or are we saying this is not an issue because those are not over HTTP and they should use another transport and the transport itself defines the shape of the response?
Those have not been addressed yet and are not the subject of this pull request. They are an interesting problem to solve.
Incremental stream probably would be over HTTP, right? Like it's likely that most uses of that will use either chunked encoding or server sent events, or some variation of that, which is part of HTTP.
Yeah, I mean subscriptions as well, right? There's just so many problems that you run into with WebSocket, so it's also just SSE over HTTP.
Yes, but I think that those are beyond the bounds of this particular pull request. Certainly incremental isn't there yet.
Cool. I will go dig through this change in more detail now that it is very well fleshed out to make sure that we've got something mergeable. But I really like this. I think it's been a long time coming for us to be like much more clear about what we mean when we say response, since there was always a little bit of ambiguity of like a handful of kinds of things that you might be responding with. And I really appreciate that this detailedly cleans them up and describes exactly the shape of what they are. And the fact that we can cleanly represent them as TypeScript types is a good indication that we've got these much more detailed out. So I might have some like tactical inline feedback, but broadly, I'm super excited about this direction. And thanks for making it happen, Rob.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
All right, Benji, you've got a laundry list of stuff to go through.
So I do. Okay, so these I'm hoping are relatively quick merges. They're either that or adding things to Lee's to-do list, I suspect. So first up, we have implementations may not deprecate a field that the interface hasn't deprecated. We've discussed this a number of times. It's RFC2. It's got approvals from many TSC members, including Lee. So I think we are good to merge this. Is there any hesitation? Otherwise, just someone press the button.
I'm curious why we didn't go all the way to approved on this last time. Do you remember why?
I think you gave some tweak feedback. You approved it and said, here's some suggested changes. And I have applied those changes. So there were changes since your last approval. That's literally the only reason, I think. You could probably just review that one commit.
This one seems really easy. All right, sweet. Merged.
Sweet. That was easy. Next up, we have the data collections trilogy, as I call it. So this is 3 stacked pull requests. The first one defines the data collections that we use in the spec, so map, list, and set. The second one recommends that the second one says that we recommend that you maintain the order of things, even if they're unordered, if you can. And then the third one goes on to specify specific ordering of certain things. Where are we at with the first one? It has got a number of approvals. So I think it's probably good to merge.
Cool. I appreciate that you kind of went through these as a trilogy. Do we want to recommend like plausibly a thing being unordered means that the very data structure that implements it is not capable of maintaining order. Otherwise, they would use ordered.
No, wasn't that because there was feedback a couple of years back that some implementation couldn't keep them ordered and that we defined them as unordered, but we really wanted them to be ordered, so ideally they should be ordered.
It's essentially that, yes. So
Yeah.
The order of values in an enum doesn't really matter, but we want to make it ideally so that every time you print that schema, you get the same SDL generated. And for that to be the case, it does need to be ordered, but also you'd still be spec compliant if it wasn't ordered. It doesn't matter that the SDL doesn't, or the introspection might return these values in a different order the next time it's queried. It's not, they're not semantically significant, but it is still useful to have them be ordered. Whereas in the response to a GraphQL query, I believe we actually specifically state that the order of fields is significant and it should be maintained.
Yeah.
I think.
This is maybe a bad idea, but I was curious if we want to be more opinionated here and literally define map and set as ordered, like all of our data structures are ordered data structures. Map is an ordered data structure that's a key value pair, and set is an ordered data structure that can't have duplicates. And then if there are scenarios where we explicitly want to define an unordered one, which are there any? Is there, I guess there are places where technically we don't break GraphQL by making something unordered, but you probably break developer ergonomics somewhere by making it unordered.
Yeah, I remember that also with the result, we had that defined as ordered, and then there was a feedback that some implementations have hash maps, and with them you don't have an ordered guaranteed. I don't remember which implementation that was, but that's why we softened that back then. It's like 5 or 6 years ago.
There's also some like really silly edge cases as well. So like consider a selection set that has a conditional select of A, then B, and then a conditional select of A again with the inverse condition. So one of them skip, one of them's include. And essentially you're saying this operation might generate AB or it might generate BA depending on what that value is set to. And that's just daft. Like you should be able to just say what the type is in an order.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between the result and the schema, because when you do code first, as Martin pointed out, you don't know the order in which the enum is defined. Like it could be that actually, or the field order, you don't know in which order they are defined in the code. .NET has a similar problem. It could just change depending on what is emitted first by IL. But in the result, it's different, right? Because that's something that you normally can control as an ordered, or you should be able to control as an ordered list.
So to answer your original query, Lee, I think it would be beneficial if most things were treated as ordered, but I also don't think that we should require that things are ordered. And if we do require that, A, it might break some existing implementations, and B, it might mean that we have clients now assume that order for some reason. I'm not sure why that would be. Oh, for example, like GraphQL Crunch or something like that, that might assume that the fields are returned in a particular order and thus just strip them all out and only return the values as a tuple. And that would be an assumption you could make based on the GraphQL spec if it was very strict on this. So
tried to do that.
The way the way that the trilogy I mean, it's an interesting approach, right?
The original Facebook Android app had a custom JSON parser that, in order to save memory and CPU cycles, did not bother parsing the keys of the JSON payload. It would just be like, I know which one I'm at now because I'm counting, and it would skip over parsing the key, which I think is probably pretty silly now. I think JSON parsing is pretty optimized on all the platforms, not necessary, but anyway, that was pretty funny.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a really interesting approach. That said, if we do enforce this in the spec, then people can make that, and if we change it later because it's silly, we would
Right.
break them. So the approach of this trilogy is essentially define them as they are currently, then make the recommendation that you try and keep unordered things ordered when you can, and finally changes in the third one some things to specifically be ordered that I think weren't previously.
Cool. All right. I think the first one is eminently mergeable. I'm gonna see if I can just merge that right away. The second one I might have some feedback on, just like language clarity. And then we'll merge. The last one looks like it has a lot of piecemeal feedback. Benji, what do you think about? I guess it's not that big, actually. I was going to say if it was big, maybe we'd chop it up, but it's just like there's a handful of places where we say list and we actually mean ordered set.
I am happy to chop it up if that would make review and merging easier.
It's not that big. I was just making sure that all of the various feedback got addressed correctly. Cool. I'll just give that one a careful read.
Cool. Sorry, Pascal, go.
Just very quick. These three PRs are all about STL and schema at the moment, right? Doesn't affect the result structure.
It relates to the data collections that we use. So I don't believe it has an impact on the result structure, but the algorithms in the spec do use, for example, a map when modeling the response data. So it does relate to them and it does make them a bit stricter, but I don't think it actually changes their behavior.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, the intent of all of these is to be editorial, just to be more clear. When we say something is a list or a set, what exactly do we mean by that? Which I think a lot of this is just translating what people already intuit these things to mean, and just being very clear. Because there was questions before about when something says it's a map, is it ordered? Is it not ordered? When something says it's a list, like, is this one allowed to have duplicates? And so we should just be like super crisp, which Benji's last change, which is technically a not just editorial change, but it is making things more accurate to how they are built on all these platforms.
That's right. And that one actually is an RFC2 pull request, whereas the others are editorial.
Cool.
Should we move on?
Yep.
Okay, next up is one-off. One-off has been basically RFC2 for, I don't know how long now, long time. It is implemented apparently in GraphQL Java, in GraphQL.NET, in GraphQL JS, even in version 15 of GraphQL JS. So no one said, this broke my app. So I think we can be fairly confident now. It's got enough usage that we can probably go ahead and merge this. I'd also like to point out it's got 163 thumbs up.
Yeah, I mean we are using it like for 3 years now. Or is that when did we create it? Yeah, it's old now. It's 21.
Awesome. Well, considering that this has been in sort of like a beta mode in a lot of our implementations for a while, I'm pumped about getting back to this and getting it merged. Benji, is there any cleanup that is necessary based on other recent changes to spec text that we want to make? It looks like it will cleanly merge, but I know we've done other.
I think it's okay, but I will give it, like, basically, if I get your approval to merge it, then I will go through and do a final check before I do. And I think there are some interesting changes that might interact with it, so we might do those out of order. But I did merge main into it recently, so and fix any of the issues. That was in February, maybe.
Cool. Let's call this one approved, and I will do a sort of final comb through of it and then get it merged.
Okay, awesome. This is going well. Okay, next up, preventing skip and include on root subscription selection sets. I had to pause on those words so I didn't get my tongue twisted. We've discussed this a number of times, but basically there's a bit of confusion around the validation of these because validation doesn't have access to variables, which means it can't detect whether something is sensible or not, or whether it will result in there being 1, 2, 0 fields. So we just want to forbid them. It's as simple as that. And I'm pretty sure that the change itself has already been merged into, yeah, it's been merged into GraphQL.js. So it's already merged, it's already out there. I don't think it's going to cause any problems, really. I think we should merge it.
Yeah, we also have it.
Nice.
It's also 21, right?
Yeah. Sometimes it takes time coming back to these. If I remember, this one was RFC2 because we were waiting on getting a full rollout of the actual implementation of it as well. But otherwise, everything about this looks great.
Could be. I think it's good to go.
I feel like at some point in the future, we need to come back to subscriptions in general and find a way to make the duplicated logic there more clear. Just realizing that we have a handful of places where we say this thing is similar to that other thing, except for this one small change, which is not always the easiest to read. But that's an aside. Cool. Did we get through all of our late stage ones, Benji?
There's one more, but this one I think is a little bit more complex, but also it's a 2020 one, so it's even older. And that is the default value coercion rules. This one, Lee, I believe you wrote up a series of GraphQL.js PRs for ages ago. I believe Yakov brought them back to life a while back and kept rebasing them and keeping them up to date. And I believe that they are now actually merged into GraphQL.js as of October last year, by the looks of it in the feed. So I believe this is now merged into GraphQL.js, and I think it's good to go. It is one that I might need to resuscitate a little bit and bring back up to date in case there are any other conflicting changes. But mostly I'm just looking for yeah, this is good to go. Let's get it merged.
Amazing. Yeah, huge credit to Yakov for crossing the finish line. I remember the history of this one, which is we started with the discussion, we realized that there were 1,001 corner cases that made this much harder than it seemed. I had like a counter proposal that I put up, and then we all got busy and moved on to other things, and Yakov decided to come back, revitalize it, and get it across the finish line. So huge thanks to Yakov. Cool. I'm super excited about getting this one done. And Benji, I'll let you take a first crack at doing a cleanup pass on the text, especially to make sure that it aligns tightly with the changes that Yakov made. And then we'll make it happen.
Okay, that's great. The next agenda item is mine, but I noticed that Martin's added a couple of things at the end of the agenda that are like 5 minutes. So I suggest that we jump straight to number 13.
Cool. Yeah, let's do that. Martin, let's talk about deprecated.
Number 13 is make include deprecated non-nullable. It's the same as deprecation reason that was some kind of thing as deprecation reason that is now merged. And there is pull request. It is merged in GraphQL JS. It is RFC2 in the spec, and if there is no objection, it looks like there was no objection, I would love to see it in the next spec release.
Accepted. In fact, I'm going to merge it because this one doesn't even require editorial change since it's all just tightly within the type system. Yeah, I remember we did RFC2 last time because we wanted to give a month for everyone to collect feedback and check any possible edge cases we missed. Thanks QA and crew at Meta for digging through your complicated side and making sure that it was smooth. I just merged this one.
Cool.
You want to do your Appendix C as well, Martin?
Yes, let's do this while I'm on. Appendix C is something I needed as an implementer. Like I often need to go through the spec and look at the actual SDL definition of like built-in scalars and introspection types and so on. And I find it convenient to have this source of truth somewhere. So I gathered everything into an appendix. It's also giving descriptions for all those definitions, which are not in the spec otherwise, like scalar int. It gives a description about what the int is. So it's kind of a convenience. I opened this some time ago. It didn't gather a lot of feedback, so I just wanted to get the sentiment of the room here. Do we want this or should we just close it? Because I guess there is going to be some ongoing maintenance with this. Every time we change some stuff in the spec, we have to change it now in two locations, so it's always a trade-off, you know. We have this place where we have everything as a reference, but it also means we need to keep it in sync with the rest of the spec. So yeah, just wanted to know what everyone in this room thinks. If you could just actually put a thumbs up or thumbs down on the spec here, and then we can reconvene next time and decide what to do with it. Or if you have anything to say now, I'm really curious to hear it as well.
So I did some review on this, and I basically I redid it to make sure that it lined up correctly. And then I also generated the schema from GraphQL.js, which is, I think, what you actually did to produce this, which revealed some interesting things, which is that, for example, GraphQL.js actually defined some of these things out of order. So having a nice reference for that would be good. As you point out, having the documentation, I think the comments on the fields is really valuable. So Lee, I have a question for you specifically as the spec editor. Do you think that putting those comments into the main introspection section of the spec would make it too big and harder to read rather than easier to read? Because they currently lack descriptions, I think, in the introspection chapter.
No, I think this is good. My recommendation was going to be make this one giant GraphQL code block, like don't chop it up by section. Have a script that auto-generates this so that anytime we realize that it is out of date, the thing you do is you just like run a script and it pulls the latest version of GraphQL.js and it regenerates this section. And then the last was like, Benji, to the thing you realized, if anything in here is kind of out of order in a way that doesn't really matter, but would aid legibility, or there's a description that just like isn't quite aligned with the current spec text, or like anything else that would make this easier to read, then we should just load up those changes in GraphQL.js and make them happen, because presumably that makes GraphQL.js also easier to read if people ever print these out. And then actually what we're doing is we're adding yet another line item in the things that high bar we're holding for GraphQL.js. GraphQL.js was always meant to be a reference implementation, and so it's expected that it has a very tight coherence between spec text and GraphQL.js. So I see no problem with placing this burden on GraphQL.js to make sure that this printed definitions is up to date. So anyway, I like the idea of having it as an appendix. I think that's cool. And I'm not worried about it being long or hard to read because kind of the whole point of an appendix is like it's there if you need it.
So just to clarify my question, these descriptions that are in the appendix, would it be good to also have them in the introspection section, like the section 3 or 4 or whatever it is?
Maybe. I think actually what we might want to do is go back through that introspection section and kind of first principles, think about what would make it easiest to read and then go from there, which I suspect does not mean inline description comments in the spec text. Like that, those descriptions are there with the assumption that you are looking at a document of that type, and there's literally nowhere else to put a description. Like the only place you could put it is here. But since we're in a markdown file and we can put descriptions above and below it, it's probably easier to read for us to do it that way. And I'm under no misillusion that our introspection section is the easiest to read, so I'm sure there's improvements we can make there. I suspect it's probably not putting the inline ones. But I do like them in this sense. Like if this is one giant GraphQL block that describes the whole built-in, that seems quite useful.
That's good. I'm in agreement. So yeah, I also think we should add this appendix.
So the question from
add in this pull request, add the script which generates the change.
and make it a one giant block, right? You said.
Yeah, I think that's just easier. It's like here's all the built-ins, and it's just like boom, the whole thing.
Sounds good. Sounds good to me. There's also a question from Pascal about scalars. Should we point to scalars? I wouldn't personally, because scalars are living in a separate spec, in a separate place. So I would keep custom scalars separate, but this is just my initial thoughts.
That makes sense.
I agree.
Just came up as I read through with int and whatever. I was like, well, there was something years ago, wasn't it? It still only has 2 scalars, unfortunately.
All right, cool. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a cool idea. I like it.
Okay, I'll cycle back to item 9 then, if that's okay with everyone.
Yeah.
Cool. So item 9 is enabling like a naked version of the schema keyword. So at the moment, if you add the schema keyword to a document, you need to give it the selection set. It needs to have not the selection set, the root operation type definitions. The curly braces needs to have that, which means if all you want to do is add a description to your schema or add a directive to your schema, you can't just do that action. You need to also define the operations, which you might be using the convention-based thing. It makes your schema more verbose, and this is purely an aesthetics thing, but I think that we should allow it to exist on its own if it has either a description or directives. Now, the main contentious point about this is a breaking syntax change, right? Like old versions of GraphQL wouldn't be able to pass this if we remove those curly braces.
Why is
that
it
said, I don't think it would pass it. It wasn't a valid syntax before.
You mean this adds new syntax that a older tool would not be able to parse?
The older tool would always expect there to be a curly brace after schema, and this no longer requires that.
Is that so? Because like extend schema should pass without the curly braces, right?
I believe that's correct, yes.
I think I mean it's a behavior change, because like if you look at the AST, you would expect there to be a query, right? If you traverse, but from a parsing standpoint, I don't know.
Yeah, it probably depends on the implementation.
Yeah.
What is the value in providing a naked schema without a directive?
You could use it to provide a description.
Oh, I see.
So to me, this change feels almost the same as what we did for like interface type definition and union type definition, right? Where in the 2021 version of the spec, interface type or object type definition does not or requires the curly braces, and only extensions can be naked. But in the current working draft, object type definition can be naked. And so it seems like this just provides a little bit more symmetry. And because we haven't cut the spec, it might be nice to make that symmetry happen all in the same spec cut.
Yeah, it's often used. I mean, it's often used to also have kind of file directives, or misused for this case. But would also be nice if we have a better solution for that at some point.
I think
So-
I'm still
Oh.
confused as to what problem we're solving.
So the main problem that I'm solving, and this is like, there is two PRs for this. There's this one, which is just mergeable into main, and there's the one that I actually want, which is based on the behavior directive, where we can indicate the behavior of a schema. The main thing here is I want to make it so that if you have an existing schema that has query, mutation, subscription, and doesn't explicitly use the schema keyword, that when you add a default error behavior to that, like propagate or no propagate, which is, you know, where we want to go in the future, that you can do that by just adding, you know, schema, behavior, whatever, and not have to also define the operation types, which may involve, you know, looking at other files, looking at other services as well. Probably you can do it with the extend syntax, maybe. But when you then print this out again, I'd rather just see it printed out with like, it's just got the schema with the behavior, and then everything else is just what you would see before and doesn't have these extra 4 lines of noise, essentially.
So
I think they're noise though.
you could use the extend syntax if you want to add a directive, right? If you really just want to add a description, you cannot even use the extend syntax, because you either have to provide directives, I believe, or you have to provide no directives, but then you have to provide the root operations. So while you can add directives just with an extend, the description use case that you said you couldn't do at the moment without also defining the schema. The question is a bit, if you think about printing the schema, when do you print the schema? Like if you print it from a code first server, then you can just print the query, mutation, subscription as well. Like it's only when you type it, right, that you could save some characters.
So we have code in the spec at the moment that says if you don't have, if you only use the default operation type names and you don't have anything that conflicts with that, then you should omit the schema, which is technically incorrect, because if your schema has a description, then you shouldn't. So this also fixes that whilst I was at it. But yeah, you can auto-generate it if you're doing it from code first. But I'm not sure that there's a huge amount of value in adding the explicit operation types. There's a reason that we excluded them by default, right? And we had code in the spec to say that these can be omitted. And what we've been essentially discussing at the nullability working group is we want to move to a future where people turn off error propagation by default. And we need a way to indicate that. And that is effectively a schema property of some kind, maybe not at behavior, maybe something else, but it's a schema property. So we want to be able to add that schema property without necessarily
Yeah.
like making every schema now and a few more lines longer.
I think the symmetry, what Matt said is actually a good reason to do that, because we did that for the types, so that when you edit SDL, you basically can create the type declaration, and then you have other files where you have then the extent declaration where you actually add the fields. And if we have that for types, I think it's also like consistent to have it also for the schema.
Am I
To
the
me,
only
that's
one?
actually the biggest reason
Yeah.
to do this.
I think I've always been the one that's been most dubious of the whole SDL, going back many years to how we were talking about this. You either have the mental model that the SDL is a thing that you write, like you put in SDL to get a thing. I've always been the other way around. I think the SDL is there to be read. Like the SDL describes your schema, whether it is human written or it is a generated file. Like its primary value is for you to be able to read it and then see what is going on, which is always why like the extensions piece always felt like a painful trade-off. Like it was a necessary step in order to create this like federated schema world where you needed to describe like schema A exists and now I'm describing an extension to schema A, which schema A is unaware of. Like you then need this extends thing. And part of the reason we didn't do it for the schema keyword was we didn't like, it doesn't make sense for schema A to not have a schema. You can't say like schema A doesn't have a schema and schema B, which extends schema A, like doesn't have that. And so like if the value here is just if you have query and mutation types and they are named query and mutation, then you're saving yourself 2 lines of writing query, comma, query, mutation, comma, mutation. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm not buying that it's worth the additional syntax complexity. All right, Matt.
I can think of one very concrete use case
Okay.
where we want this, which is you have a few versions of your schema for reading where you want to give some people a read-only schema and some people a read-write schema, so it does have mutations.
Read-only still have a query
And
type.
the read-write schema is an extension of the read-only.
Mm-hmm.
So
and the
you
read-only one
can't
has a thing where you have query comma or query colon query type, and then the extension extends query to add the mutation type. But you still need this change to do that.
Given query, did we make it so that query is now, if you don't have query at all, it's still valid?
No, you
You
need
could
query
just
still.
have-
We
No,
did
query is
discuss that,
required.
but it's not been passed through yet.
Okay. But if you have like this naked schema, it's the equivalent of not having schema at all, which means you just assume defaults. I do think that there's some level of composition where I only want to define the mutation type in the schema area, like schema module that defines the mutation type that in this schema is going to use once it all composes together. Like you want readability not just of the whole thing, but also the subcomponents that you are using to compose it, that whole thing.
I'm down with that. My primary worry is the absence of the curly braces and the query and mutation types being defined. To me, reads as ambiguous as to whether the appropriate behavior is to assume the defaults or is the appropriate behavior to assume that you have defined a schema that does not have root types and that later you'll extend it to add root types. It's not immediately clear by reading it which one is happening. And I would much rather just be explicit. Like if that takes writing 3 extra lines of query text, I think that's the right trade-off for being explicit.
Maybe it's if you have like maybe we should. This is also the, should we have empty curly braces, or do you have to have something? Like, this is why we went with, you don't have empty curly braces, right? Like, it could be that we could say, if you have schema at all, then they must be defined somewhere, which, so it's like, if there is a schema at all, then you must explicitly define your query type somewhere. It can be in an extension, but it must be explicitly defined. I'd be okay with that as being the, like, which is a slight change to Benji's proposal, but.
If we were to allow empty curly braces, it still wouldn't be ambiguous, right? Because to be valid, you have to have a root query type, and so so because of that, it's, there's only one answer. If you have them empty, you're using the default, and so I think the question here is to what extent do we value as a design decision for SDL it being clean and just not having unnecessary cruft.
So I just wanted to say, for me, this isn't coming from a writing the SDL point of view either. This is coming from a reading the SDL, and more specifically, it's coming from writing GraphQL examples. I very frequently write tiny little GraphQL examples, type query, here's my field. And in the future, I want to turn on no propagation by default, right? This wants to be the standard default that we use for new schemas going forwards. That's a discussion for later, but let's assume that it is, or some future behavior is. I want to be able to show someone a simple schema that is basically schema, no propagation, and here's my type query with the field on it. I don't want to have to add those extra lines, which is more things for them to pass and to understand. I just want those examples to be really short, really readable, and really easy. And this, not having this detracts from that, only marginally. It's literally only 2 extra lines in this example. It's query, query, close curly brace, and then on to the rest of the example. But it is still, like, it turns a 4-line example for a user into a 6-line example for a user. And it's just a bit more for people to process, especially if you've got a lot of them in your docs.
So I like this motivation, but I'm still nervous that understandability and number of lines are not necessarily the same thing. Like, I would worry in that scenario that people basically like don't understand what the query or what the schema keyword does. Like, if you're reading that far and you get to schema and then a directive and you're like, oh, this is just how I do schema directives, and like, can I do more than one of them? It's like, nope, you can only do one. This is where you define your schema. I've defined my schema, then like, what type is it? It's like we've like introduced the concepts out of order. Maybe this actually just says more about like what is the right mechanism by which we expose this property on a schema, and maybe this is just a heavier way to do it, and that's part of what we are reacting to. But it still makes me really nervous. Like, I know the symmetry thing makes sense, but like, so for an object type, we have in the SDL, we have the ability to define an object type and omit the field's definitions. You don't have the curly braces. But that is a invalid state. Until you've extended it, you have not produced a valid schema yet, right? There's no default behavior. It's just, this is a object type which does not yet have its fields defined. And the expectation is later an extension will pick that up and define it and turn it into a valid schema. So if this is a symmetry thing, then I would expect schema with some stuff there, omitting the types definition, root types definition, to require an extension to come in later. That would be the symmetry with a object type, which I don't think is what we want here. Like, that would be more confusing.
Yeah, I do think, like, Benji, with your examples, possibly what this is really pushing on is the directive should be on type query.
What, so
Because-
you
Yeah, no-
disable error propagation on queries, but not mutations?
Well, we could define it that it has to be on all root types. for the scheme. Like in order to be a valid schema, it must be present on all root types. But theoretically, if you're in a migration state, you might want to like migrate your subscriptions to not do this while you're, because there's like a much smaller thing and not everything on your schema. Like there's a theoretical, like maybe there's like an absolutely absurd thing, which is maybe you need to do error propagation from like recursive down, and like maybe it should be on types in general. But this is getting into like maybe nonsense, but it might be the case that any directive that we would think belongs on a schema actually belongs on the root types. I don't know, but like that might.
But there is the case for general settings that you want to have, and what the community is doing, like also a proliferation, or also what we in composite schemas is us thinking about is like you need to have a place where you can put these options. And this is typically done on the schema. It's a bit misused because it's like this global thing where you can just stick things on. Could also be that we need a different mechanism for file-based settings that you want to have, or whatever. But I think that's where the motivation comes from.
I'd like to move us on. So this was a really interesting discussion, and I'd like you all to think about it, and I will bring it back to a future working group. But there is a reason that I did it as a separate pull request and didn't put it in as part of the main pull request. Okay, let's get on to the next one. Number 10, disabling error propagation via a request parameter. I was really sold on this when I wrote it, and since then we've discovered a few little issues which I would very much like some input on. So when we proposed this originally, the idea was that we want to be able to disable error propagation. Error propagation is problematic. It's problematic for normalized stores and various other things. And today's clients are able to handle errors on the client side. We can do it with like 0.5 kilobyte of JavaScript. We can do it with like relays, directives. There's lots of ways of handling this. So I think we should move towards a future where there is no error propagation. So then we talk about how we would do that. And there's lots of different ways of doing that. One way is to add a directive to your operations, like you write query, you say no bubbles, please, and then you have the rest of your query. The issue with that is you would have to add it to every document that you write, and B, that it's actually the client that most likely wants to set this rather than the user. The person writing the GraphQL query is probably not going to care too much whether there's error propagation or not, because we're leveraging the fact that the client itself has this ability to reproduce the errors locally and make it so that you can't read an error null in a null position. You would get an error instead. So if we do it as a request parameter, then it's essentially, and to be clear, this is a GraphQL request parameter, not an HTTP request parameter. If we do it as a GraphQL request parameter, then it means that it's up to the schema authors, it's up to the server to decide what to set it to. And you might set it based on a parameter that comes through in the request. It might be something that you default to based on the endpoint, but it gives you the ability to start a new GraphQL schema today, a new fresh one that hasn't got any existing clients, and just have error propagation disabled by default in that new schema. Originally, when I proposed this, I said the client relay would say on error, null. Always set this to be null. Whenever an error happens, just put a null there. I don't care about it. Don't blow things up. Just put a null there. But we wouldn't know whether that was honored or not. So my original proposal was that in the response, we would then mirror that. So we would say, as part of the response, here's your data. And also I used the on error null behavior, or the on error propagate, or on error abort. That seemed a reasonable way to do it for me, but it's also kind of annoying because it means you don't know what to expect. You could expect any of these. So this is an alternative proposal, which instead says that we trust that it will be honored, and that we can trust that because there is a property in introspection. And that property is the default error behavior. And that's where you specify in your schema what your default error behavior is. I'm currently proposing 3 error behaviors. I'm proposing propagate, which is what we have today. I'm proposing no propagate, which is effectively everything becomes semantically non-null. We just put the nulls in the location and we trust the client to read the errors and to correlate them and make it so this null is never actually read by the user. And the third is abort. Turns out there's lots of scripts where people just want to see if there's any errors, and if there are any errors, it just throws away the result. And at the moment, we're still making the server do a lot of work in those cases because it still has to compute the entire result, even though it's going to be thrown away by the client. We've also heard from, I want to say Shopify, it'll be in the issue, I think, that this is actually something that they care about and they already have this kind of behavior already. So I think these are the 3 main ways of doing, of choosing what the error behavior should be. So we need a way of indicating A, what the schema's default for this is. And personally, I don't think that abort is a reasonable schema default. And B, what the client wants, so that, for example, Relay can say, I don't care that the default is propagate for legacy client compatibility. I want you to not propagate for me, please. Discussions around naming aside, we need a way then, like if you're doing code first, then it's no problem. You just add the property default error behavior. But we need a way to print that in SDL. So I have proposed the behavior directive, which allows us to also specify more behaviors in future. If we change other things about how GraphQL works, we can add those as additional arguments on this one single reserved behavior directive. We can, of course, add different directives if that's more appropriate, but I quite like it. I think it's quite clean. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Originally, because this was an introspection feature, I made an introspection enum, like typekind, called error behavior. I've called it error boundary in this. That's my mistake. It's error behavior is what it should be called. And that means that we can indicate through that directive what the default error behavior is. The issue is this breaks like all existing tooling. It breaks GraphQL because when GraphQL reads the directives, it says, sorry, this behavior directive that you've defined is not valid because it uses an introspection type as its argument. Of course, it's technically like an introspection directive, kind of. Maybe the issue is that we're using the type both in introspection and also when printing the SDL, but there's clearly an issue there. So I've done a little experimentation and I tried writing it as a specified type. So we have 5 specified types currently: string, float, int, boolean, and ID. And I thought, why not add error boundary as also error behavior? Sorry, I keep saying error boundary. Error behavior as a specified enum. That'll be fun, right? That turns out to break other parts of the schema because of the ecosystem, because people often do mapping of their schemas. And when they do, for example, lexicographic sort schema, they're going to go through every type. If it's a built-in type or a scalar, then they'll just leave it as is. But if it's an enum, they're going to make a new enum that has those things, but in the lexicographically sorted order, which now means when you try and build a schema with it, you've got 2 versions of error boundary, the built-in one and the lexicographic one, which isn't an issue if you update everything to the latest version of GraphQL, but it is for any existing tooling, for GraphQL Code Gen, for graphical, I can't remember if GraphQL, I think GraphQL's okay with it, actually. GraphQL's happy with it. GraphQL Code Gen's not happy. GraphQL Yoga I tried out as well, also broke. So there's that. I also considered making it as a naughty scalar that can only accept these 3 string values, but I think that's a little bit icky. And another option is that we use just the built-in scalar types, and we instead break this up into multiple properties. So we have behavior, is error propagation on or off, and is abort on error on or off, is another option for it. So my question to you all is, which path should we take? What do you feel based on this?
For
kind of like-
the, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
For like the scalar, like alternative, so the abort boolean would like override the other option. Like whenever abort is true, that's it, right? Okay.
Yeah, essentially that, yeah.
Okay. So it's like a combination of like two booleans, but we actually only have like three permutations. Okay.
Exactly that.
Thank
Well,
you.
there would also be null, but that would be a bit ugly, right? We have null, true, and false, but
No,
it's bad.
they're non-nullables, and they have defaults, but the combination of them results in three different things. And the error propagation Boolean makes no sense if abort on error is set to true. Like, it doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter whether it propagates or not, because it's just going to blow up the whole request.
As a thought experiment, the schema directive, could it be expressed only in introspection and not in the SDL? And so then the configuration of a server, it would happen outside of the SDL. Maybe we could define in the spec, there's this parameter that would be provided to execution that controls the behavior for the default error handling, and then it's exposed by introspection, but leave it out of the SDL definition. And then optionally, if a schema-driven implementation wants to define its own directive, it could, but it wouldn't be officially part of the SDL.
On that note, I really like to have it on the schema because the thing is that to validate, actually you could still validate queries without it, right? You wouldn't need to know what behavior actually is enabled or not. You can, all queries are still valid. So you could still do validation. I'm just thinking about the tooling side, right? Where you just get a graphical schema and you get a bunch of queries, and then you have to make sure that all the queries still execute. That could be any of the services, Hive, Nitro, or the open source ones that make use of the combination of a set of queries in a client and the schema, but they all still validatable. So
yeah, they'd all validate. The main issue would be for things like code gen. If you aren't using something like throw on error and you have the default behavior be no propagate, then everything is nullable, right? Because it would be null on error. So it might generate the wrong types. That's the main issue.
Also, when you use a client and you do introspection, then you read something like if you use Relay or Apollo client or whatever. Usually, what you do is you do an introspection query to get the schema, and then you map it to the STL and you store it in the repository. Now, when you don't have a place to actually put the configuration that how the client should be generated, then you lose that ability. You actually have to have a flag now somewhere in the relay configuration that says that you actually want to use the error behavior. whereas the default error behavior could just be provided by the server, so to say, through introspection and then the SDL file. So I do see value of having it on the in the SDL.
I think to that point, I would just argue that every GraphQL client from now on really should try and be an error handling client. Whether or not the schema says it supports it now, like it might in future, so adopt it now. And ideally, I think we should be pushing for that as an ecosystem. Martin.
Should we update GraphQL to not check for the double underscore? Because it feels like this prevents any evolution of the introspection types. Like this does not reserve option value.
It's not GraphQL that's at fault here. It's earlier versions of GraphQL.js, which are then baked into GraphQL, because when you validate a new directive, you assume it's not a built-in directive because you've got a list of those. It's not one of them, and so it forbids it because it thinks it's from user code.
So it's not happening with current version of GraphQL.js?
The version of GraphQL.js that has this feature does not exhibit this issue because it knows that this directive is a built-in.
Yes, but
an earlier
that's my
version of
point.
GraphQL wouldn't.
Yeah, like version N of GraphQL.js will choke on any new introspection type introduced.
It will choke on any new directive that uses an introspection type as a parameter. And the difference here, of course, is that every other directive that we've used so far has just used the built-in scalars. So it hasn't been a concern.
But do we want to keep it that way? It feels it makes it really hard to evolve the built-in types, and it basically means we cannot ever add new built-in types. And it basically makes the whole underscore underscore totally inoperant, I think. Like, because if we cannot add new underscore underscore types, why reserve them in the first place?
Right. And I think one of the key questions here is this an introspection type or not? And that honestly isn't clear to me, because it is something that a user, if they were doing SDL first, they would write schema at behavior on error and then give a value for this thing. And if that's an introspection type, we presumably shouldn't actually be using an introspection enum type's value when we're specifying our schema. But equally, it is the value that you would get back from introspection. So maybe it is a new built-in enum type. And that's what I'm currently leaning towards, is that it's a built-in enum type, error boundary rather than error behavior rather than double underscore error behavior. But I'm really not sure. And yes, we should also fix it so that future versions of GraphQL don't get upset.
I mean, there would be one way of expressing the Boolean, right? The Boolean issue that you have in the introspection, like the double underscore on the SDL feels weird, right? So technically, there could be a one-off on the introspection that says which kind is enabled, and then you wouldn't have to define both the enum and the enum.
So that's interesting, because I really thought you were going to use the trinary nature of Booleans instead. It's either true, it's false, or it's null.
That's what I proposed. That's what I proposed 10 minutes ago. But that didn't seem to be a good idea. So I try something else.
It's a one-off of Booleans, 3 Booleans, and all of them are only allowed to have the value true.
Terrible.
Okay, I think we've got things to think about on this front. This is something I'm generally really, really keen that we try and move towards this future of the entire ecosystem moving away from error propagation. So I would like to keep this moving forward, and I would love to have your input on this. I don't really mind too much how we get this ability to turn off error propagation. I would like it to be ergonomic. I would like it to be a very sensible and comfortable default for users. And I want to make it so that like error handling clients is like the default approach. But I don't specifically care on the mechanism too much. So if you've got other ideas, like one of the things that we sort of not quite proposed when we were discussing the previous topic was maybe we can use a different keyword. Like maybe we can just use a keyword that says, you know, error propagation disabled or whatever, rather than using it as a schema directive. Yeah. Should we move on to the next item, Lee?
Yeah, I just had a couple quick thoughts at the end is Benji, I know one of the things we're excited about here is for this to be a bit of a temporary state. And that was just an area that I couldn't quite see how this doesn't become a permanent state. Like how we make sure that this doesn't require having a directive forever for clients that are in our preferred mode. And then I like supporting abort, but it also worries me that sounds like abort is something that we want a long-term support for. Some clients will just always prefer that behavior. And how do we make sure that we get to a good default while also being able to support that behavior?
So I think one of the fundamental things here is I don't think that error propagation is 100% wrong. And I think it makes sense for certain types of clients. There's sort of middle ground of clients that can't put like shell scripts, for example, that aren't going to be able to reproduce those errors locally and are just using something like curl, but might still just want to read through the data, and they don't care that an error will null something out. So I think that propagate is here to stay. I mean, it's in the first version of the spec. If we ever get rid of it, like that's going to break all previous versions. So I'm okay with essentially a use strict style of we're opting all future schemas into no error propagation by default, but it's still a behavior that we support and will support forever. And I think one of the really important things to note about error propagation from the spec point of view is it's like this much of the spec. It's a tiny, tiny bit. It's all in one specific section that says what the behavior there is. When you go to GraphQL.js, it's just like you catch the error, you add it to the errors list, and then if this Boolean is set to one thing, you throw it again, otherwise you don't. And it's just that. It's such a trivially tiny thing to support. I think we should support it forever. So yeah, I am essentially saying that all future schemas should, and to be clear, schemas are opting into this, not necessarily the clients. The clients can opt in early during the transition phase, but if the schema says I'm in no error propagation mode, the client doesn't even need to say anything. It will just consume it in that way. So we just need the schema itself to have one little thing somewhere that says I'm in no error propagation mode. That's my opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious if there's a way to do this without the server side needing to communicate this as part of introspection, but maybe that's part of a broader discussion we can have later.
I mean, on your note now, Lee, as you said that it's considered a temporary state, and in the future, or even what Ben said, in the future, it should be the default that we set a certain state. That would actually speak a bit against a schema directive, because you would put something into your schema which eventually has to go or suddenly becomes the default. So it's a bit weird.
Yeah, it can't, like, definitionally the default is what happens when you don't specify something, and if it requires a introspection change or schema definition, then that means changing the default is a breaking change in the future. So it might just be the only way through, but I'm hoping that we find some path that allows us to, someone can provide an SDL where they don't have to explicitly define this behavior once all the dust is settled, and this is the way that we suggest everyone do things. But I want to avoid the developer footgun of, if you do the thing the simplest way from like lines of code written, that you actually unfortunately do things the not preferred way, because it's just not the way that the default got set up for historical backwards compatibility reasons. So that I think that's
Yeah,
not to crack.
yeah. On the other hand, from a developer point of view, changing defaults is the absolute nightmare of an upgrade, right? That's the biggest issue. When you upgrade and you don't have a compilation error, it just completely behaves differently. So that's
Totally.
Yeah, and to be clear, like once you've created a schema and you have clients to it, you would never change the default for that schema. Like any change would be a breaking change, whether you change it from propagate to abort, or propagate to no propagate, or no propagate to propagate, or to abort. Any combination of these will break existing clients. So you make that decision the moment that you create that schema the first time. And yeah, it becomes an important decision. And maybe in a future version of the spec, we require that it is present, or we require that you get kicked out an error if you don't have it set, or we introduce I've forgotten the word for it. What was it I used on the GraphQL over HTTP spec? Like a cutoff time. You introduce like a cutoff time, and you say from 2035, 1st of January, the default is going to change to this. You know, you've got 10 years to get ready. Let's go. Like there are options.
The area that I'm interested in exploring is making this not a property of the schema, but a property of the service. And maybe that has other negative ramifications, but I'm hoping that that gives us a path to allow a service to move forward, and not to have it be encoded into your schema. But
that's an interesting way, because previously I feel like you've described the schema should detail the capabilities of the service. So for example, the presence or not of subscriptions indicates whether or not the service should support subscriptions. But that said, like I'm open to outside negotiation, and we have an issue of introspection in general, like the 2 or 3 phase introspection problem. So having some kind of flags that you can indicate that says how this service works is I'm open to, but I do think it was a change from what we've previously proposed.
yeah, I think so. Okay, appreciating that we have just about run out of time, and Benji, you have 2 other topics for us. Are there any that you want to tee up for folks to dig into in advance, or put up action items for folks?
Yeah, let me just go over them real quick. So the first one, I think the action primarily is on Yuli, which is the execute selection set versus execute what was grouped selection set, but I'm currently proposing we rename to execute collected fields. Lee, I've got discussion in that based on what you've said before. I think we should keep the term grouped field set. I think that is the correct term. And I think we should actually fix the spec so that it is the correct term by literally using the word set. And I have a separate pull request that does that change, which I really like. Like it makes a lot of the algorithms make a lot more sense. So like when you pass fields to execute field, before that was like weird. Why are you executing field but passing it fields? But now you're passing it a field set. Oh, and we define field set to be a set of fields that all have the same response name. Suddenly, that actually makes a hell of a lot more sense. So I think that's a really good and positive change. But I also respect that like calling it execute collect fields is more sensible. So there's that. Separately, there's the define execution as in before execution begins. I have incorporated Martin's work on this. I've also incorporated the feedback that we had from last month, where we've elided the prefix on various things. So we now just have request, query, mutation, subscription, and subscription event. And this, I think, makes it a lot clearer about all the different stuff. So this is something that's been open since 2021. This is now rebased on top of that previous pull request that we were just discussing. So I would love to move this forward as well. And I think they're all going to sort of move together as a chunk. So yeah, feedback on all of those would be much appreciated. All right, that's me.
Awesome. Okay, I personally will dig through a bunch of these and try to get as many of them merged as possible, and then tee up discussion for the others. And if anybody else in the room is curious, please jump in and provide feedback as well. We'll get those steered. Thanks for all of the other engaging discussion, folks. We got a lot of really interesting things happening simultaneously, and I appreciate everybody's help on moving GraphQL forward. See y'all very soon.
One final question: should we reintroduce the mid-month meetings, because these have started running out of time again? We stopped them for a while. Now we've got the spec release coming up. Maybe we should reintroduce them.
Yeah, we might need to.
Yes.
Until
At least
July.
after we released it. Okay. See you guys.
I like it.
I'll signal you, Lee. Bye.